Budget Oversight. We are now in public session. I have apologies today from Deputy Joan Burton. Before I begin, can I please remind members and witnesses to turn off your mobile phones. Interference, as you know, from mobile phones affects the sound quality. Today's committee we will hold in public session first, and we will then move to a private session after our meeting with the Minister, or at a break which we may have with our meeting with the Minister, depending on how the timing of our session goes today. Firstly, obviously, I would like to welcome Minister Paschal Donoghue, Minister for Finance, Public Expenditure and Reform. He is accompanied today with us by John McCarthy, Assistant Secretary, Department of Finance, Brendan O'Leary, Assistant Principal, Department of Finance, Ronnie Downs, Assistant Secretary, Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and John Cannan, Principal Officer, Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. So, Minister, thank you for accommodating our request for an early meeting in your schedule. I appreciate it, but I would also like to acknowledge the work of your office in arranging this. So the purpose of our meeting today is to discuss the following key issues, and if we can try and keep to our, just for timing reasons, to our key issues today. The Committee's engagement on December 15, 2018 with IFAC in relation to its fiscal assessment report of November 2018, Brexit and the fiscal budgetary impact, the Committee's engagement on December 11, 2018 with the Department of Health on the issue of the significant overruns in the health budget. And on this issue, Minister, we just would, as a committee, feel that we should make a note of the fact that we had requested a meeting with officials from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, which was declined to this committee. But to make as I said, just for members here today, just to try, if we try and stick to those key areas, to try and make the best use of the time which we have. So just to go through some of the, obviously, the housekeeping on it in relation to privilege. Just to draw attention to the position and privilege which applies, which is to advise you by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to their evidence to the committee. However, if they are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on any particular matter and continue to do so, they are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. They are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, they should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Now, with that done, Minister, I would now like to invite you to make your opening statement.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and thank you, members. Thank you for the opportunity to be here to say a word about the matters that you have raised. In terms of the outturn for 2018, for the first time in over a decade, our public finances are balanced in cash terms. This is not an insignificant achievement, given where we were only a few short years ago. The main budgetary metric for international purposes is the general government balance, and this will be reported by the CSO at the end of March. However, based upon the Exchequer figures, a small general government surplus is now possible. A small deficit of 0.1% was projected in the recent budget. We are now aiming and believe likely to deliver a surplus of 0.1%, which will represent an overachievement of that target. To achieve this Exchequer cash surplus, we used the 2018 revenue overperformance, albeit this was largely driven by, as I've acknowledged, corporation tax. This represents a positive development in terms of reducing our overall debt burden, as the day-to-day running of the central government is now being met from within resources, and we're not borrowing to fund these activities. In 2019, current expenditure will grow by 3.9% compared with 2018. In 2018, the equivalent growth compared to 2017 was 5.6%. Much of this increase was driven by an overrun in the health sector. If I exclude growth in health expenditure in the current area, total expenditure grew by 4.8% in 2018 compared to 2017. Turning to the outlook for this year, in assessing our draft budgetary plan, the European Commission, the body charged with formally assessing our compliance with the EU rule, has assessed Budget 2019 as being compliant with fiscal rules and have projected that we will achieve our medium-term budgetary objective this year. However, this of itself does not represent any grounds for complacency. This is because our debt burden remains highly elevated at 105% of gross national income modified versus a comparable 87% for the euro area. In that context, at budget time, my department projected a balanced budget in headline terms, moving to a surplus thereafter. However, given that the external economic outlook is deteriorating, the probability of a disorderly Brexit is rising, and quantitative easing is ending, our policy approach should be to target larger surpluses to build up our budgetary buffers for when times become less favourable. It is my intention to run budget surpluses into the future if the economy continues to perform strongly and to use them to reduce our national debt. Furthermore, any windfall receipts that arise from the state reducing its involvement in the banking or financial sectors will also be used to pay down public debt. A notable feature of smaller open economies is they typically operate budget surpluses when their economies are close to potential. This helps build up capacity for the future and helps allow steady improvements in public services. This also runs the risk of increased funding being absorbed without risk of inflationary pressures. And furthermore, many of these countries can enjoy and do enjoy a high stock of public infrastructure as investment is maintained. Notwithstanding this, our public finances are moving in the right direction, and this is testament to sound policies in recent years. Our task going forward will be to continue to build on these hard-won and difficult gains and to try to maintain stability and security in our public finances. Some of the policies that I have committed to implementing in this regard include the establishment of a rainy day fund. In addition, by continuing to maintain a broad and stable tax base, I hope to ensure the state continues to be financed properly. The rate of VAT in the hospitality sector increased to 13.5% from this month. This measure will allow us to reduce our over-reliance on increases in other tax heads, such as corporation tax, and allow the continued development of our tax base. In recent years, different measures represent the positive move in this direction. In addition to the VAT change, measures included the introduction of USC, local property and sugar tax. These now fund 5.7% of overall government revenue. Furthermore, it is my intention to publish a set of proposals in the coming period, look at how we can further reduce our over-reliance on corporation tax. At this point, I want to acknowledge the work of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council in relation to Budget 2019 in terms of their assessment and endorsement of the macroeconomic forecasts underpinning the budget, as well as for the analysis set out in the November 18 Fiscal Assessment Report. I welcome the observations of the Council and I recognise their important role. My response to the Fiscal Assessment Report will issue shortly and will be available on my department's website and shared with you. I want to state that I am in agreement with many of the points made by the Council, including their assessment of our economy's strong performance to date, as well as the key risks it's facing, mainly external in origin such as Brexit, raising trade protectionism and an evolving international tax environment. One of the issues that arose at the meeting of your committee on the 5th of December with members of the Fiscal Council was the charge that my department faces serious challenges in predicting corporation tax receipts. In fact, a widely recognised feature of our corporation tax base is its high concentration of receipts among a small number of firms, leaving this tax head much more exposed to specific developments. A further complicating factor in forecasting this tax head is the budgetary timetable, which means that the second instalment of annual corporation tax doesn't fall until November, a full 2 months after the forecasts have been finalised. In addition, the Revenue Commissioner and my department both rely on information from companies around expected profitability, which can often be underestimated. In fact, the Council, in a 2016 review of the challenges forecasting Irish corporation tax, indicated that this is due to the concentration of receipts, including amongst a small number of firms, which mirrors our export sector. IFAC has acknowledged that forecasting corporation tax has traditionally been difficult in Ireland. They test a number of alternatives to my department's methodology, and these provide a slightly better outcome, but still provide a large variation versus forecast. They conclude that this suggests the importance of idiosyncratic developments in explaining annual movements in corporation tax. A second charge that was made at the meeting on the 5th of December was that Budget 2019 was based on a relatively benign outcome in terms of Brexit. However, in Chapter 6 of the Economic and Fiscal Outlook document, alternative Brexit outcomes apart from this central scenario were explored. Indeed, the possibility of a no-deal Brexit has influenced policy decisions in terms of our stated aim of balancing our national finances and investing in capital infrastructure. This is also why I am adopting measures to build up our budgetary buffers to help better ensure our economy can withstand the impact of possible shocks in the future. By running a balanced budget this year and targeting budgetary surpluses beyond 19, we're ensuring that we don't add to our already elevated levels of public debt. A third issue was the assertion that medium-term spending projections lack credibility given the probability of expenditure overruns. I would point out that when preparing the expenditure allocations beyond 19, the ceilings are prepared on a careful and contained basis, which maintains allocations across all spending departments and which takes account of demographic factors in the areas of health, social protection and education. In addition, the overall spending profiles include separate and unallocated provision. The amount is distributed across departments in the context of the annual budget process, for example, in terms of public service pay and pension agreements. In adopting this approach to forecasting, my department is mitigating against the risk of simply restating ceilings and applying inflationary pressures. This approach would lead to expenditure baselines ratcheting ever upwards and would preempt the space for better discussion of policy priorities. I'll just give a brief overview of the outturn for 2018. Total gross voted expenditure was just over €63 billion, made up of €57 billion in current expenditure and €6 billion in capital. This amount is €1.3 billion, or 2.1% ahead of profile for the year. Of this, 1.1% relates to current expenditure, while €118 million refers to capital. This is broadly in line with the projections for the year set out on Budget Day last October, when additional spending was announced for a number of areas, primarily health, housing and education. These priorities are also a reflection in the allocations for 19, which were published in the revised estimates volume last December. This year, the government has allocated a total of €66.6 billion in gross voted expenditure. The vast majority of this is for day-to-day current expenditure, amounting to €59.3 billion, with a further €7 billion allocated to capital expenditure. Funding for the key day-to-day public services of social protection, health and education account for 80% of total gross voted current expenditure. The allocation for health for 19 is over €7 billion. However, given the scale of this allocation, I'm acutely aware that the last number of years, and in particular last year, saw an overspend in this area which impacted on the overall level of resources available for the public service. With this in mind, there is now ongoing engagement between my department and the Department of Health in relation to how we can best manage this expenditure and ensure the provision of these additional resources is matched by increased levels of accountability and transparency in expenditure matters, particularly within the HSE. Housing has been prioritised for 2019. There is a total allocation of €4 billion. This represents an increase in year-on-year terms, in particular in relation to capital expenditure, which is up by 1/5. In terms of education, the allocation is up by 5%. Looking more broadly at expenditure policy, the Fiscal Advisory Review refers to the rapid pace of spending growth between 15 and 18, noting that this was largely driven by year-on-year increases in spending. In assessing the Council's criticism of recent expenditure policy, it should be noted that expenditure growth in the post-consolidation period has been significantly more modest than was seen in the pre-consolidation period. Between 2003 and 2008, gross voted expenditure grew by 63%. Between 2014 and 2019, gross voted expenditure will grow by 23%, or just under 5% per annum. I should add that we can't take this for granted, and I will continue to work hard to maintain a disciplined approach in relation to how we manage our public spending. And if I were to listen to the many, many demands made from many different quarters and from many different lobby groups and interest groups, all raising legitimate issues on behalf of their members, and if I were to accede to even 1/2 of these demands, public expenditure would have been significantly ahead of the rate to date. However, we need to use this period of relative economic strength to be conscious of the great risk that we face in Brexit, to be conscious of the priorities that we're looking to ahead, and then finally, again returning to the higher than anticipated revenue generated from corporation tax. It should be noted that these revenues are facilitating important government initiatives, including the support for capital investment. Further, it should be noted that there was a not insignificant once-off element in the increases in receipts for 2018, and that the overperformance also arose from a combination of enhanced trading conditions and increased product sales. Corporate profitability has almost doubled since 2010 and saw annual growth of just under 10% in 2017. Capital expenditure, in turn, can play a very valuable role in our economy. It's up by 24% this year, a total level of €7.3 billion, and I do believe it's important to use this period of strength in our corporation tax receipts to accelerate infrastructural investments in the area that we do need it most. However, insofar as expenditure management is concerned, we do have a record of steady increases in the support of social and economic development for our country at more sustained levels in the past. Moreover, these planned increases are being delivered on budget and on time across virtually all areas of public expenditure. I do recognise that there are particular challenges within the health sector in which all practices in that area are now being stepped up. To conclude, I'm deeply aware of the growing challenge that we have of Brexit. I've outlined about all we have done to respond to it to date. Much of the commentary around our economy does tend to fluctuate between the risk posed through overheating on one hand and the challenges arising from Brexit on the other. And then, in addition to all of this, of course, the context is the needs of our society and our citizens. As Minister for Finance, the best course of action open to me is to look to maintain stability in our public finances, try to build up our budgetary buffers for when times become even more difficult, and balance our books. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Minister. Now, I have a large number of members indicating that they wish to question, so I'm going to go with our usual process of an initial 5-minute tranche, and then if there is additional, we'll come back to it at a later point. First Deputy who had indicated is Deputy McGrath.
Would you just be helpful to outline the sequence of the sequence, if you don't mind, just
of deputies so far.
the next number of speakers.
Okay, roughly what we have so far is we have deputies McGrath, Bailey, Chambers, Breathnach, Broughan, Lahart, Doherty. And we now have Deputy O'Brien after that. Okay, well, Deputy Barrett after that as well. So that's pretty much nearly everybody. We'll work through it, as I say, if we can. Just to clarify what I mean when I say 5 minutes, that's 5 minutes for questions from the Deputy, and the Minister obviously can answer, but it's up to yourselves how you use those 5 minutes. Deputy McGrath.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to welcome the Minister and his officials. I'll just focus on two issues in the time available to me, Minister, and the first one is corporation tax, and you addressed it at some length in your opening remarks. So looking at the numbers, it's quite staggering. About 10.4 billion of receipts in 2018. Back in 2015, to put it in context, the government were then predicting that in 2018 we would collect in the region of 5.5 billion. So it has close on doubled. Now we have the Seamus Coffey report from June 2017, which said that corporation tax receipts can be expected to be sustainable over the medium term to 2020. Now, at that time, the figures he had that he was working off were 2016 figures, about 7.3 billion. So now we're up even 40% on those numbers. So my question to you is, given the level of dependence which is growing, given the level of risk that there is to the public finances and the wider economy as a result of that growing dependence on the multinational sector, and in particular a small number of multinational companies delivering these huge corporate tax receipts, is it time to review the sustainability of those receipts? So I would ask you not to rule it out immediately. I want you to consider the need for a further report, an updated report that looks beyond 2020, that takes account of the recent boom in receipts and examines the sustainability of corporation tax receipts for perhaps the next 5 to 10 years.
We're already looking at that very issue. I have outlined in my opening statement some of the difficulties that we do have from a timing point of view, and for the first time that I'm aware of, I indicated at the end of last year that there is an amount of the corporation tax that was collected for 2018 that we do not believe is sustainable. We believe it's one-off. That figure is €700 million. And I am looking at proposals and ways in which we might form a further view in relation to sustainability of corporation tax. In terms of what we are looking to do to address that risk now, there are two things that we have done, Deputy. The first one is that we have built our tax forecasts for 2019 of between 900 million and €1 billion lower than we collected in 2018. And the second thing that we have done is, this is the key reason I made the decision to increase the VAT rate on the hospitality and services sector, because it's my view that it's only through doing measures like that that we have a prospect of in turn being able to reduce our reliance on corporation tax in the future.
What I'm asking really, Minister, is will you consider an independent report to examine the sustainability of corporation tax receipts, given that that Coffey report is now essentially outdated, given the growth in the receipts since and the fact that his conclusion only took us to 2020. It doesn't say whether it's the beginning or the end, but now we're in early 2019. So I think there is a need to refresh that, to have another look at sustainability over a longer term. So what I'm asking is, will you consider an independent report which is arm's length from the Department of Finance?
I'm certainly happy to consider that. I can assure you, in the engagement I have with my officials in the Department of Finance, they're every bit as alive to the risk that we face and able to provide an independent assessment of it. And I'm just conscious, as I answer your question, that I do already have an institution that's independent of government that has a role in many of these matters, which is the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council. But yes, I will give consideration to your suggestion, Deputy.
Thanks, Minister. The second issue, Chair, I just want to raise is, following yesterday's vote in Westminster, the prospect of a hard cliff-edge Brexit is a very real one, and it's one that we have to be prepared for. My question to you, Minister, is Has your department carried out in recent times an assessment of what the impact would be on the Irish economy in 2019, in 2020 of that scenario? And I'm talking about employment numbers, taxation receipts, economic growth. I know we have the paper from late 2016, the joint paper by your department and the ESRI, but what I'm talking about is the more immediate impact this year and next year on tax receipts, employment, economic growth. Has your department modelled that, and if so, will you publish it?
So the last model we did of that was just a short number of months ago, Deputy, as part of the Budget 2019 Economic and Budgetary Outlook. In that analysis, we highlighted our best estimate of what a no-deal scenario would be. This showed that after 5 years, the level of output in our economy would be around 3.25 points lower than in a no-Brexit scenario, and also made available figures in terms of employment and outcome and output. The next point at which we would normally look at reviewing our forecasts in relation to various risks would be in the Stability Programme update, which, as you know, is due in April. However, since the Government and I published this work, we have seen a number of reviews that was done in the United Kingdom in December, publishing their latest estimate of what would be the effect on the British economy in light of a no-deal scenario developing. And I've asked my own officials now to review those figures and see if we would be in a position to give an update on the effect of a no-deal scenario beyond what we have already indicated.
Yeah,
so we have done a forecast. That forecast was part of the budgetary process, and I will review this now to see if there is a need to update that further, particularly in light of the scale of the vote that happened last night.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at Chapter 6 of the Economic and Fiscal Outlook published on Budget Day. It references the paper from late 2016, and I think that's where the projection of the level of Irish output would be around 3.25% lower in a disorderly Brexit scenario after over a 5-year period. And it does say that in the shorter term there would be more immediate impact on, because of regulatory divergence, sterling depreciation, disruption to trade, consumer spending, investment, competitiveness, public finances. But there are no numbers put alongside any of those. So we don't have any numbers, Minister, in relation to the short-term impact. So tax receipts, economic growth, employment, 2019, 2020, we are potentially staring down the barrel of a cliff edge no-deal Brexit. Does your department have those numbers? And if so, will they be published?
No, and this is why, Deputy, that I've asked that a review of our economic forecasts take place earlier than we would normally do. Because, as I have said, particularly in light of the scale of the vote last night, I believe from the point of view of the Oireachtas, let alone myself, it is important to review our forecasts far earlier than we would normally do. And when that information becomes available to me, Deputy, and I'm looking to do it as soon as possible, yes, I will publish it.
And that will include numbers on a disorderly Brexit, that scenario?
That is exactly what we are doing. The only point I will say to you, Deputy, is that this is going to be very, very heavily caveated. Yeah. Very heavily caveated. Because what we are doing is we will be looking at figures that just came out of economic bodies in the UK a few weeks ago. And what they are trying to do is form a view in an event that has never happened before. Never in the history of the global economy have we had an economy as large as the British economy and as integrated into the rest of the global economy leave a single trading bloc. So the forecasts that have been done in the UK alone are based on assumption upon assumption upon assumption. And from my point of view, not only would I then have to build on that, the challenge of having to factor in two things is giving us food for thought, which is why we are reviewing our figures. And those two things are, Deputy, what would be the second-order consequences of a disorderly Brexit? So yes, we can model, but only model, our views on what would be the effect on investment. But it's very difficult for us to be absolutely as clear as we would like to be about what could be the consequences of regulatory non-alignment, because this is a new risk that is developing in front of our eyes. And the second issue that we have to factor into our work, Deputy, is we're trying to understand, and we have worked on this, in the event of a no-deal Brexit scenario, what would be the mitigant of policy measures that would be taken that in turn could reduce the net policy effect. But Deputy, to answer your question, are we doing this work? Yes, we are, in light of what has happened. Will that work be made available to you and the committee? The answer is yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deputy McGrath. Thank you, Minister. Deputy Bailey.
Just a couple of broad statements and a couple of questions. Just to say I very much welcome the increase in the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government. And just because we often talk about figures and what the tangible result of that will be with that increase in investment into that department. People never talk that it's going to be 10,000 social homes delivered this year, almost nearly 8,000 built and acquired, and that will be supporting over 45,000 people in accommodation while we get their forever homes built. And people never really talk in those terms, more so they're driving around in billboards and being negative about stuff. So I very much welcome the increase in spending in that department, and a lot of funding went into resourcing local authorities and Bord Pleanála to get all those systems up and running. And as somebody who knows a little bit about housing, and I go through all the planning applications of all the local authorities in Bord Pleanála, I see now the volume of applications coming through that we've never seen in the last couple of years. So I very much welcome that investment in the right place. A lot of commentary this morning around the Children's Hospital, and while I have a view on the location and all that, I'm parking that myself today. Again, as a parent of young children living in Dublin, I'm acutely aware that anybody living outside Dublin, the stress and the fear of a child who's sick in a hospital. I just want to put on the record that as part of the funding for that site, there will be 380 individual ensuite inpatient rooms for families to be able to stay with their children. There will be a 53-unit family accommodation facility, again for parents to be on site with their children. And I think sometimes when we talk about broad figures, we lose what the emotional effect and support will be given to people that live in this state. So I'm also acutely aware of the inflationary costs around construction and our skills shortage, and I know a lot of that comes down to the overspend. But just in relation to that, I'd just like to hear a bit more detail about how closely you're working with the Department in Health to maybe not have as big an overspend in that department later on this year. And then the final question is around the US and what impact US tax reform is likely to have on our corporation tax, Minister.
Thank you. In relation to your different points there, Deputy, I think it's the link that you have made between money we spend and the effect it can have on people's lives. It's a point very, very well made. It is encouraging now to see the scale of increased homes that are being built, but as I am well reminded from my engagement across the country and in my own constituency, we still have a long journey to travel, and I'm very much aware of that. In terms of your second point there in relation to the Department of Health and the engagement that we have with them, from my point of view at political level, it's virtually every day. From the point of view of my department, it's each week the significant engagement goes on. What is a particular disappointment to me in relation to the scale of the overrun that we had with the Department of Health is across the previous 2 years we had made significant progress actually in reducing the health supplementary estimate that was needed at each point. And then for a number of different reasons, Deputy, we were not successful in maintaining that approach as we moved into this year. What we are doing now, and just to give context to that, in those figures in 2016, there was no supplementary estimate needed at all. In 2017, the figure was €195 million. Both those years were a big improvement on where we had been before. And then, as I said, in 2018, the difficulty that I faced and the government faced is now well known. What we are doing now is that we are engaging with the HSE and the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform and the Department of Health now on a monthly basis on where we are month by month, and in a even more intensive way than we have done in the past. And we have a very clear idea now by policy area within the Department of Health what figures need to look like on a monthly basis. In light, as I said, of what happened last year, this is even more of a priority for me than it normally would be. In relation to your question on corporation tax, I visited now the US twice since middle December. On one occasion, I visited policymakers in Washington, where I met the Treasury Department, the State Department, the Department of Commerce, and then last week, for example, I visited the West Coast of America. And it is apparent to me that the overall policy package that we offer in corporation tax, but also on many other areas, most notably how we manage data policy in Ireland, is an offering that I think will continue to be very, very competitive in 2019 and beyond.
Sorry, could we just, Minister?
It's on airplane. It's on airplane. I don't know why.
I'm kind of scared to answer it.
It doesn't even allow me to answer it.
We might just, if we can't.
It's off now. It's off. They've given up.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, Minister.
No, I've answered the question.
Thank you, Minister.
Okay. Deputy Bailey, you're happy there?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. If that is the case, our next Deputy is Deputy Chambers.
Thank you, Chairman. Minister, thank you for your speech there. And just to get back to the Brexit issue, Minister, in your budget speech you said that across government the necessary measures to prepare for Brexit are being put in place. These plans are based on a central case that there will be an agreement in the coming weeks. Now, clearly there hasn't been an agreement, and obviously the vote last night was, whilst expected, was extremely disappointing, and it's difficult to see where we go from here. And I would agree that it really is for the UK now to say where they want to go, but nonetheless we have to prepare as best we can for what could potentially be coming down the tracks. And my concern is that all of the eggs from government are in the basket of getting a deal, and nobody wants to, I suppose, countenance the prospect that we may potentially face a no-deal scenario, possibly at the end of March or maybe even a month or two after that. And just want to refer you, Minister, to the Parliamentary Budget Office, their publications post-budget. They've done quite a bit of work around an orderly Brexit being the central scenario for macroeconomic and fiscal forecasts for 2019. And they say that no sensitivity analysis has been provided by government on the impact of changes to the Irish output induced by a hard Brexit on revenue and expenditure projections. So my first question, Minister, is that clearly Budget 2019 was based on there being a deal. You yourself said this. You did also say that you, I suppose, took into account the potential of a no deal, but it didn't appear to be factored into the actual figures. And I think the Parliamentary Budget Office were quite clear in saying that that analysis has not been done. What is your response to what the PBO have said, and does that impact in terms of projected expenditure for 2019?
Just to deal with each of your different points, Deputy, and I agree with your opening sentiment that the result last night in the House of Commons is clearly exceptionally disappointing and concerning. And as you have said now, the responsibility does sit with the British Government in terms of how they are going to move this issue forward and deal with the different issues that developed in the debate. But in so doing, the Taoiseach has outlined today in leaders' questions the needs that we have from the point of view of the Irish Government and the European Union in terms of how this issue moves forward. To deal with each of your points in turn, yes, it is correct to say, Deputy, as I said on my Budget Day speech, that the central scenario for my economic forecasting was based on there being a deal. Because at that point, when I put together my budgetary arithmetic and the overall model, that did look like the most likely scenario. What I am now doing, as I said a moment ago to your colleague, Deputy McGrath, is I am now conducting a further assessment, as I said, particularly in light of the scale of the defeat last night, of any impact that could develop in Budget 19 in 2019 in terms of the scale of that impact on our economic forecasts for this year. To go on to your next question, do I believe this will have an impact on our expenditure plans for this year and any decisions in that area? The answer to that question is no. Our expenditure plans are laid out at the moment, and I will provide a further assessment as to where those spending plans are and our economic outlook through the Stability Programme update. But at this point in time, I'm clear that they will stand, and I believe that that will be the case for 2019, and I will be affirming that in my Stability Programme update. In terms of the sensitivity analysis that the PBO are referring to, that is what underpins the figures that are published in Chapter 6 of our report. But perhaps if I am in a position to give any further solid assessment of the impact of a no-deal Brexit in 2019, we can look at how that could be fleshed out further. And in relation to how we prepared, there are many different elements that I would refer to in terms of how we prepared for different Brexit scenarios. But the key one from my point of view is that we are increasing capital investment in our economy by 24%. And normally when a government tries to make decisions about huge increases in capital expenditure, those capital expenditure increases normally kick in when the point of uncertainty has passed in our economy. And I timed the phasing of our capital expenditure to coincide with where we are with Brexit. And also in Budget 2019, there was an allocation of €115 million in different measures across different government departments to build on the investment that we had in Budget 2018.
I suppose in relation to your response that you don't foresee any changes to expenditure for next year, projected expenditure, I have to assume that there's reliance then on the rainy day fund that's in place if extra money is needed. And it is good to see that Fianna Fáil policy was endorsed and accepted as prudent. A 24% increase in capital expenditure is welcome. I suppose it does matter in terms of context what the baseline is and where you're starting from and what you're increasing from. My final question, Minister, is have you sat down with other ministers across departments, be that transport, agriculture, education, to have a very frank conversation about what they might need for their departments in the event of a no deal? Has any other minister given you a request that they may need additional money in 2019 in the event of a no-deal Brexit?
So in terms of do I believe it will impact on my current expenditure plans, I was referring to this year. I think you said next year.
Sorry, 2019.
Yeah, I was referring to 2019 in the answer that I gave you. So the expenditure plans that I have at the moment for 2019, those figures are set at the moment, and I am confident as we move through 2019 they will be maintained. In terms of your question about engagement with other government ministers regarding the different Brexit scenarios, all of the different engagement that we have had to date has dealt with different Brexit scenarios. Most of that engagement over last year dealt with the central scenario, which was the assumption of a deal. Across the latter part of last year and then into the early part of this year, yes, there has been a very high level of engagement with a number of departments in relation to expenditure needs for a no-deal scenario. That has mostly been focused on how we would deal with some of the consequences about the need to get infrastructure in ports and airports in place more quickly than we would have assumed under a orderly exit, and I know that I will be having even further engagement now in the coming weeks with colleagues, particularly in the Department of Agriculture, regarding different issues they could see developing.
Just a final question to clarify. If what's to be spent in 2019 is based on there being a deal in a central case, one would have to assume that if there's no deal, the money required to be spent is going to increase. So how then can you say that you don't foresee any changes to expenditure regardless of Brexit?
Well, what I was referring to there were the negative effects that we could have in Brexit in terms of the possibility for expenditure to be reduced. What does happen in any given year, and has been the case for the last number of years that I have went through, is in any given year we can change our spending profiles within government departments in response to events that can occur. And that is certainly something that there would well then be a need to engage in the event of a disorderly Brexit. There are a couple of different ways in which that could happen. The first one is we can make the decision to look at whether priority decisions need to be made in the context of a more imminent and urgent need that we would have. The second thing that we could look at doing is whether decisions need to be made in terms of where current expenditure is allocated. And I will work with all of my colleagues in relation to this. I am very alive to the risk and the severe risk that a disorderly Brexit will pose for our economy. But I will go back to a point that I have made to each of your colleagues in the committee before, Deputy, which is this is a unique event if it occurs. And I will look at if there is a need to review the understanding that we have of a disorderly Brexit in the context of information that's emerging from the UK now nearly every day. But I would stress that much of the information and predictions that they are predicting in turn are based on a higher level of assumption than you would normally see. But information that, when I have talked to government about this, and yes, would be available to the committee or to the Oireachtas to give an update on that too.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you. Next deputy up is Deputy Breathnach.
Firstly, thank you, Minister, for your attendance. I'd like to firstly focus on the whole issue of improving budget scrutiny, and indeed that's what some of this committee is about, and oversight. AIFAC criticised Government 2019 budget plans for not being credible, and they referred to that the previous budget basically stuck to plans, whereas the last one, and to quote Mr Coffey, said the government did not stick to the plan. The budget day package was larger than previously signalled. We had significantly greater within year spending increases for 2018, with little or no savings elsewhere to offset them. I could go on and quote him, I'm not going to continue, but I just want to know, Minister, clearly, have you issued a formal response to those concerns? And has your department studied those concerns that have been raised in that fiscal assessment report, and what steps have been taken to address them? Just on an issue relating to the Christmas bonus, which was raised also by IFAC, and obviously we've had recent comments by Minister Doherty in relation to this, where it was said that the budget is not realistic if it does not make provision for the whole issue of the Christmas bonus. And would you comment on that in relation to you considering committing to the Christmas bonus in next year's budget? In addition to that, obviously, health expenditure overruns clearly were the order of the day in relation to our discussions in relation to that. And I just want to know, Minister, what steps, or proactive steps, have been taken to get to grips with that, and is he fully satisfied with the quality of budget information that his department receives to monitor the expenditure in the trends in the health area? And finally, not just as a board or minister, but others have referred to Brexit, I just want to, and I won't be coming back, Chair, I just want you to particularly comment on what is becoming clearer and clearer to me, regardless of Brexit, and I've been saying it since I came into this Dáil, the whole issue of illicit trade on a cross-border basis will certainly come to light in a no-deal Brexit, or indeed with any deal. We had the Grant Thornton report a number of years ago in relation to the whole issue of illicit trade, and I mean, even in more recent times, the public alcohol bill, and I spoke about it today in the Chamber, and I want you to re-raise it because it's going to have a huge impact on retailers, both on the border and beyond, in relation to Minister Harris's proposal to introduce minimum pricing. And in addition to that, it is very, very clear to me that on the whole issue of carbon taxes, that if grips is not got in relation to that, we will have a floodgate of activity. We already have it in relation to solid fuel. It's been brought to my attention, for example, that currently in relation to carbon tax losses on solid fuel, and equally the whole issue of the VAT, that at an estimated 10% evasion, we're running somewhere in the region of a loss of the order of 12 million just in relation to solid fuel alone. And Brexit combined with that, and I, for one, am not advocating any form of border controls. I'll just finish now. I just want to know what steps are being taken by your department, not just in relation to solid fuel, but in relation to ensuring that this leakage, which is phenomenal and is not being calculated properly, what steps have been taken to make sure that it's brought to heel.
Thank you, Deputy Breathnach. So just to go through each of your different points in turn. Firstly, yes, of course, I have studied very carefully the Fiscal Advisory Council assessment report. I mean, in each of the other two budgets I was involved in from an expenditure point of view, they did not raise the kind of issues that they have raised in the most recent one. And that's in the way that they have now, and that's one of the reasons I take what they have said so seriously. I'm not dismissing their views in any way, and we need to take on board, and I need to take on board their analysis for moving into this year. Have I responded back to them? No, I haven't yet. I'm going to be doing it in the next few days. It's going to be pretty much in line with what I have said to you all here today, though. And when I issue the letter, I will send it on to you as a follow-up from this meeting, and the letter will be available on my department's website. In relation to what Minister Doherty said, well, look, you know, there's always an anticipation and a need to fund a Christmas bonus. And one of the issues that I'll have to consider is that if government feels that it should be funded in a new way, how we can factor that in then into our budgetary calculations. And I look forward to talking to Minister Doherty about that, about how that could be done. In relation to your point about the public alcohol bill, I understand your point completely, and I am more familiar than you might think with how supply chains work in the retail business, and I understand how wholesale operators work, and I understand their ability to source any products, but particularly alcohol, from multiple different locations. And I know what the grey market is. I want to assure you all my involvement in it was always legal, but I understand how it works because of my career before moving into politics. And I know exactly how a move in any indirect tax can have a far bigger effect than is commonly understood than on the tax base within this jurisdiction. And I'm aware of what Minister Harris has said there about the public health bill, and of course the triggering of that is a decision for him, so I respect what he said. But in the run-up to that decision, I will be indicating and will talk to all of government regarding what the consequences of that could be, because everybody does need to be aware of that, that if the price of a key wholesale good moves out of line with other markets that we are integrated with, there could be consequences for that. And this is something that I will return to. And in relation to carbon tax, that underpins part of the reason why I did not move on carbon taxation in last year's budget. In the second half of 2018, there was not a consensus nor an understanding on what a move in carbon taxation actually meant and the many consequences of this. And those who want to advocate for this and who want to try and make it happen, and I understand there's a need for it, I want to see how we can do it, need to be more clear what are the different consequences of it. It changes the costs of things that are really important to people's standard of living, and it does have an effect on other things within our economy, such as the issue you have just raised, if our carbon taxation is out of line with other jurisdictions. But all that being said, I do believe, for many other reasons, that we do need to try and build up a model as to how carbon taxation can be steadily changed and give indications to citizens and investors that in the medium run the pricing of carbon is going to go up. But that is going to be a challenging piece of work for this year.
Thank you, Deputy Breathnach. Deputy Broughan.
Thanks, Cahill. Just to follow up on that, though, Minister, wasn't the key reason you did nothing about carbon taxes was because you were hoping to have an early general election, which would possibly have taken place by now, etc. And it was politically impossible. I noticed, by the way, you're talking about the tax and dividend approach now, or rather the Taoiseach is talking about that, which seems to imply that carbon taxation, which would hurt obviously our poorer households, that it would eventually go back to people. Just to ask you, are you saying in relation to 2019 though that there is a very significant chance that we are going to have another budget, or we're going to have a revised budget? Even circumstances as they are right now, as the British Parliament goes into another important vote today. I mean, is that the reality? Like, you presented us with this omnibus proposal for the omnibus bill, 17 sections. I mean, and I think I asked you a question about that. Your questions have been deferred, but I mean, has that been costed? Have you costed the impact of that legislation, were we to go forward with some or all of that? I mean, have you actually done a costing on that? And just to ask you again to return to the question, I think Deputy Breathnach on in relation to the FAR report, the Fiscal Advisory Council. I mean, was it not an astonishing critique, Minister, of your administration of the Department of Finance? When you look at that large report and the key points that your 2018 spending, taken with your 2019 and budget 2019, and I quote, "The plans are not conducive to prudent economic and budgetary management," end quote. Very fundamental point. They say, Professor Coffey and his colleagues say that repeated budgetary failures, and again, quote, "they've left the public finances more exposed to adverse shocks." So you've actually left us in a more difficult circumstance because of your conduct of budgetary policy in 2018 and your plans for 2019. And then, as colleagues have said, and I quote again, "the medium-term budgetary plans are not credible." They're just not credible. You've dropped previous medium-term plans, and then your current plans simply can't be believed. I mean, isn't that a very fundamental problem? I asked Professor Coffey when he was here, and one or two other colleagues as well, in relation to net policy spending. And it was quite clear, obviously, that the problems about corporation tax was inhibiting net policy spending rising in line with sustainable revenues, because you haven't got a system of sustainable enough revenues. That's the problem. You're just talking about doing a report on it. I know the IFAC didn't say that to us, but I think Professor Coffey has said elsewhere that your fiscal approach, your whole fiscal stance, and I quote again, has echoes of 2007. So isn't this an incredibly severe critique by the statutory government body meant to oversee the work of you and your two departments on the whole range of areas of how you've computed spending for 2019, how you exceeded it in 2018, how you were not prepared, and we gave you some suggestions like equalising diesel and petrol revenues, for example. You weren't prepared to get the additional revenue necessary. I think one of our journalist colleagues said that Professor Coffey is a hurler, and I think maybe he's a goalie actually, but that he gave you a fairly severe rap of the hurley, you and your departments. And isn't that a fair assessment of the report? But it's a very damning assessment, really, given that you're in charge of the department. You're in charge of the department going into this era. Just to ask you about health spending, is that budget oversight group consisting, I think, of your two departments, or rather deeper, of the Department of Health and the HSE? I mean, is that actually up and running now, so that we can get adequate forecasting? It was our committee here, as you remember, Minister, and colleagues here beside me, who identified the huge lacuna in health spending for 2018, the fact that you had to come forward with supplementary estimate for 655 million and upwards. So are you beginning in any way to begin to get a grip on that? Ordinary citizens, by the way, are quite upset and horrified at the huge escalation in costing of the Children's Hospital The way every time we look at it, or every time you or Minister of Radker or the Minister for Health talks to us, the price of the hospital is higher and higher and higher. And I know, looking back at the record, by the way, your old constituency colleague, Deputy Ahern, I think played a nefarious role in that whole matter, you know, by interfering in it and postponing the location of the hospital and the building.
Thank you, Deputy Broughan.
It could be built by now.
Thank you, Deputy Broughan. Your 5 minutes is up, Deputy Broughan, and I'm holding you to it the same as I held every other Deputy. Minister.
Thank you, Deputy, for your questions there. The only commitment that I have given is that if there is information that becomes available to me in relation to the likely effects on our economy of a disorderly Brexit, that is information that I would make available in advance of when I would normally do it, which was in the Stability Programme update. At no point in this meeting have I said that there would be a need for a new budget this year. And the spending plans and the tax plans that I have for this year will be kept in place. And then, as I said to Deputy Chambers, if we have to deal with additional and new risks that develop this year in relation to how we respond to a disorderly Brexit, I will work on those within government. But what will happen is that if we face a exceptionally serious shock, the key way in which that will evolve is that it will feed into the automatic stabilisers that our budget does have. So it could well have an effect on where we are. Well, it will have an effect on where we are in terms of our challenge to look to balance our books in 2019. As that information becomes available to me, I will update the House on it. The only thing, a few things I'll say in the context of that, is our budgetary performance for 2018 is better than I had indicated to date, than I indicated on Budget Day. I have acknowledged that some of that was driven, that much of that was driven by the fact that corporation tax went up in Q4 and that an amount of the corporation tax that came in was not spent. And that higher level of corporation tax has now not been built in to our economic figures for this year. In relation to what the IFAC have said about this budget, as I said earlier on, I take what they say seriously. I'm taking it on board. In other years, yes, they did raise issues around budgets. Let's acknowledge that. But clearly they have raised it to a higher level in their recent commentary. And whether it be a hurl or whatever, I will take on board what they have said and look at how that can be implemented for 2019. In relation to has our group met in relation to the management of health expenditure, actually myself and my colleagues in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform have met twice on this topic in January, and I have already had engagement with the Department of Health on it. But we never anticipated sitting down in the way I have outlined until we have at least 6 to 8 weeks of expenditure available to us, because it's only at that point we would have a sense of any particular trends that are developing within any part of our health service. But we will be doing that. In terms of what you said there about the budget, every single budget I've been involved in, there's been forecasts and expectations that this is an election budget. That election has still not materialised. I believe that the government I'm a member of and the main opposition party will continue to work together throughout all of 2019 to deal with the big challenge that we have.
Thank you very much, Minister. Deputy Lahart.
Thank you, Minister, and your officials for your service. So this is the Budgetary Oversight Committee, Minister, and I think we're entitled to maybe a little bit more detailed response to some of the questions put by some of the previous speakers. So let's look at some of a summary of the criticism of your budget. Okay? Some of them have been mentioned. That it was based and premised on the idea of an orderly Brexit, that it's pro-cyclical with no evidence of counter-cyclical measures, that it's promising budget. You've been promising budget surpluses since 2016, and you're back here today promising them again. That the improvements in the general budgetary situation in Ireland have stalled since 2015. That stall has happened in spite of strong national and international recoveries being in place. That there's been a stall in spite of a supportive monetary environment internationally with low interest rates. That you're over-reliant and continue to be over-reliant on corporation tax, despite warnings, continuous warnings. That in the period actually from June 2018 to September 2018, you increased your projected spending by 1.1 billion, just in 4 months. That your budget isn't consistent with prudent budget management. That you've introduced difficult to reverse increases in spending. That your budget involves failures which represent a repeat of the policy mistakes of the past. That the public finances have been left in a more exposed position to adverse shocks. That your budgetary plans for the future lack credibility. That you fudged any climate change measures in the budget in the week when Ireland was it was announced that we were second worst in the class in the European Union in relation to climate change. Never mind the carbon tax, but any other measures. That your 3-year budget ceilings aren't working, with repeated pro-cyclical upward revisions to those ceilings. That your health spending and lack of inclusion of the Christmas bonus poses that just those 2 things, never mind overruns in other government departments, pose upward risks to expenditure in 2019. That you're dependent on windfall receipts which are being used for day-to-day spending. And that revenue growth has been supported by short-term cyclical developments. They're pretty, you talk about learning from the mistakes of the past. It's a common theme in your speeches. Now, those who were there in the past can argue that the only person who said there was a problem coming down the line was a little-known economist in UCD, because all the other agencies, including the Central Bank and the ERSI, spoke about soft landings. You've been getting warnings, and they're escalating, particularly from IFAC. You don't actually gesture towards the independent budgetary office's report on your budget. You don't reference that, and you don't reference the submission made by this Budgetary Oversight Committee. So for all your talk about prudence and having learned the lessons from the past, and these aren't journalistic comments, these are comments from statutory agencies, as Deputy Broughan said. And I don't think you've given us a comprehensive response to pretty damning indictment of measure after measure after measure after measure. In summary, you don't seem to be heeding the advice that you're being given. And the second summary is, you seem to be repeating exactly the same mistakes that have been made. Thanks, Chair.
Well, you made a number of points to me. I'm not sure where the questions are and what you said, but I will respond back to your points. And you also made the assertion earlier on, Deputy, that a number of questions were put to me that I hadn't responded back to. That's not the case, but of course any deputy here, if they're unhappy with an answer that I've given, has the option to put another question to me or to ask the question to me again, which of course I will do. Answer. In relation to the overall point that you've made, I point back to another set of figures, notwithstanding the fact that I've made clear that I acknowledge the views that have been published by IFAC and will look to take them on board for 2019. But let me give you some other figures in relation to it. The other figures are, as I said in my opening statement to you, that between 14 and 19, gross voted expenditure increased by 23% across that period. In comparison to the period that you're referring to, the comparable figure was 63%. So you ask me, what am I doing differently to what I have done before? The answer to that is a rate of current and capital expenditure growth that is significantly below what has happened in the past. The fact that at each of my budgets, the criticism from some has been that the shift and the change in take-home pay has been only €5 a week for many, shows that I have been very careful to not put in place taxation policies that in any way could contribute to an overheating of the economy on top of the income growth that is happening. So you ask me what is different to where we are now versus the period that you're referring to. The two big chunks that are different that I have put in place is a significantly lower rate of expenditure growth than the period you're referring to, and taxation packages which in all cases are below the cost of indexing our tax code, and many have argued are not adding to the take-home pay of individuals. And one of the reasons why I have taken that approach is precisely because I am aware of the risk that tax packages that move in the cycle of economic growth, that very approach is the kind of approach that happened in the past, and that is an approach that I am not maintaining again. What I would say more broadly is in the many years now of dealing with this issue, and in fact dealing with this committee, never yet have I heard from any deputy the charge that I am spending, that I'm spending too much. That's not a charge that has been levied at me. I've never had an appearance in front of this committee where a mainstream charge has been the rate of expenditure, for example, that you have from a total government point of view is too high. The charges and the needs that I always face are to spend more. And your own party deputy over recent months has been involved in calling me to spend over €3.4 billion more. So the responsibility ultimately does sit with me in terms of what are the decisions that are made, because I'm privileged to hold this office. But what is different to the past is rates of expenditure that are significantly lower than the past, and income tax packages and social welfare packages that are considerably lower than the past as well, because I know what ultimately proved to be the case is much of that turned out to be unaffordable. But a further point you go on to make, that if we have warnings, we should take them on board. I'm aiming to do that. I've outlined what we're going to do, particularly in the area of health for this year, but I'd also point to other things that are in place for the end of last year, like setting up the Rainy Day Fund, and the particular point now that we finished up last year in a surplus as opposed to having any form of deficit. One point that you did make and did say that is incorrect, though you are repeating this from others that have made this charge, the assertion that at different points I said I was going to move to a surplus in any budget that I was involved in doing. I have never done that. At each point what I have said I will do is reduce our deficit, and in each budget we have over-delivered versus that target. I've never at any point in a budget that I have given said that we will move to a surplus in that year and then missed that commitment. That hasn't happened.
And IFAC actually made...
Sorry, you have 10 seconds, Deputy, to be fair to say Deputy Broughan.
Sure, no, and we will have another round as well, but
yes.
just it's IFAC actually make the point that you committed to budget surpluses in 2016 for 2018, in 2017 for 2019. It's IFAC has made that, so it's not my assertion. And any of the assertions I made are actually, none of these are personal. These are all from the reports of the PBO, from the Governor of the Central Bank, and from IFAC. These are not, this is not a political charge. This is the Budgetary Oversight Committee. And any of the statements I made.
What I did actually say in responding back to your point, Deputy, is that the you were actually repeating the assertions of others. So I acknowledge that.
No, I accept that.
I said that. Yeah. And particularly the point that it's been made
But you said in any
surplus.
1 year.
What I'm saying is the case. I said two things. I said that you were repeating the assertion of others, which you are doing, as I've acknowledged. And the second thing that I said is that in any given year, in a budget that I have given, in that year, any target that I have set from a surplus or deficit point of view, I have either met or exceeded. And that continues, and that has been the case in my two budgets as Minister for Finance. But, you know, to go back to the tone of all of this, you are referring to institutions, one of which is independent of me, which is IFAC in particular. They have raised, in particular for 2018, an issue in relation to unplanned expenditure that mostly centres on what happens in the Department of Health. That change in the Department of Health was very different to the last 2 years, to the previous 2 years that I've been involved in that issue. And I acknowledge that for 2019, we need to find ways of doing it differently. And that is what I am working to do. But I stand by the point that I have made, that in terms of rate of expenditure growth and the combined impact of tax and social welfare packages, they're of a different magnitude to where we were at this point in the preceding economic cycle.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Pearse Doherty.
A couple of quick questions, Minister. First of all, and welcome to yourself and the team. When are you going to respond to the IFAC's assessment of your budget 2019?
Within the next week.
Okay. I would say it's a pity that that response wasn't there on the public record and we could digest it, because I would say it will be a lot more detailed than your opening statement that you made to the committee, and it would have been just more efficient if we had seen some of that detailed response.
If I can come in on that, actually, Deputy, I'm working on the draft at the moment, because I work on all these things myself. It will be in line with what I have said here in the committee. What will be different to what I've had an opportunity to say so far in the committee is I do feel that the decision that we made in relation to the VAT rate could have got more prominence in the discussion that has happened since the budget. I'm due to be in front of the committee again, Deputy, in a number of weeks' time on other matters, and I'm very happy then maybe to deal with that point at that committee.
And that was only a timing point. But you've heard there from other colleagues in terms of the critique from IFAC, and there's no two ways about it. IFAC have took off the gloves in relation to Budget 2019. We've heard the comments from other members where they've talked about not conducive to prudent economic and budgetary management, not consistent with prudent budgetary management, medium-term budgetary plans are not credible, and go on and on and on. And there's numerous references through the report. In relation to those specific charges that Professor Coffey and his team are making in relation to Budget 2019, do you dispute them?
I believe that the budget that we put in place is a sensible budget, and the budget that was the one that was best available for me to be able to deliver within this Oireachtas. So I do not accept that this was a reckless budget, but there are specific points within the budget, within the IFAC report, that I do accept. The ones that I particularly accept out of the ones that you have outlined is where we are on unplanned expenditure, particularly within health, and the impact that has on our medium-term forecasts. And I accept those points.
Can I ask, maybe let's talk about, because he doesn't just signal out, and the team doesn't just signal out health in terms of medium-term budgetary plans. They actually give us the full graph and highlight every one that they think is not credible or lacks credibility. And they're very clear. They're saying, aside from some allowance for demographics and a ramp-up of public investment, the department ceilings are largely flat for later years. This implies, implausibly, large and sustained decreases in non-interest spending as a share of GNI. What they're saying, Minister, is that what you're presenting here is that you're going to spend less money than you actually will end up spending. The Fiscal Advisory Council are saying very clearly that you need to spend more money in each of these areas, and that's the reality of it, but the figures that you've projected are not credible. And it's not just on health. And the reason they're saying that is because you've only dealt with demographics and inflation, but there are other pressures that will be in those departments during those years. Do you not accept that?
And Deputy, this is one of the areas that I do take a different view on, because there are decisions that are made each year, budget to budget, that are a result of policy decisions that have to be made by the government of the day. Different ministers for finance and different governments in the future, and I hope this one continues for as long as possible, obviously, have to make decisions each year in relation to what their service priorities are.
So,
just to finish off, so I said to you what I accept in relation to what they have said on the Department of Health. I have said in particular that some of the consequences of that for the medium-term forecasting I do accept. Where I do differ is I believe that some of the assessment undervalues the fact that any government on budget day has to be able to make their own policy priorities, and there has to be discretionary expenditure decisions that they can make. And those then have to be funded, and in many cases have to be built on to medium-term forecasts that are published.
Okay, so do you stand by the fact that between the years 2019 and 2023, that under your proposals, as outlined, that expenditure as a percentage of GNI is going to fall by 2.5%? That's a dramatic decrease in expenditure in this state. That's not credible. Everybody knows around this room that that's not credible. That's not going to happen, Minister.
And what I expect will happen is that as we move through these budgets, decisions will be made in relation to maintaining services in some areas, in relation to new services in others, and in relation to capital expenditure that will change that.
Yeah, but that's the point. The figures are
Excuse me, Minister, for a second. Sorry, Deputy, if you let the Minister answer and then you can come back in, it'll make for a better flow.
I was only going
I thought this was a better flow, but
I'll share the meeting. Thank you.
Fair enough, Chairman. I was going to conclude my sentence and then I'll respond back to you. Much of the thinking that I have read on medium-term forecasts, my view is that it underestimates the fact that the government of the day will have to make policy choices in 3 different areas. Do they retain services in a particular area? Do they need new services? Or do they need to change levels of capital expenditure? My view, therefore, is that as future budgets are done, if I have the opportunity to do them, and as other ministers have the opportunity to do them, that the share of government expenditure as a percentage of GNI or national income will at least stay constant, if not grow, and taxation decisions will have to be made in order to do that, or decisions will have to be made not to do other things.
Look, I appreciate that, and I'm going to move on to another point, and you can maybe pick up on this point at the end. Is the figures you're presenting for the latter 3 years, they have no value to this committee. They have no value to external people who are looking in, because they're not credible, as you say, because you're not going to reduce expenditure by 2.5%. So why present them in the first place? Like, you should present something, and you still have the flexibility to change the figures, but to present figures that we know are rubbish, because they're going to all be increased, devalues the work of this committee and devalues the work that your officials are doing. I do want to ask you a question, and I'll lump these two together. There was stinging criticism by IFAC in relation to budget. Did any of your officials in the department provide you with any of that type of advice? That's one question, because hopefully they did. I'm not sure if the Right Report recommendation has been implemented, that all decisions in terms of budgetary matters by officials are written down and are available for freedom of information after a period of time. But I hope to God that some people are speaking up. In relation to Brexit, can I ask you the question about contingency planning for Brexit? Can I ask you to outline to this committee, because this is one of the risks that's been identified in the IFAC report, what engagement have you had with revenue officials? What preparedness is now taking place by revenue officials? We heard, for example, in the British-Irish Chamber of Commerce meeting that took place late last year, in which Minister Creed was at, that a senior revenue official talked about them doing contingency planning in terms of agricultural products that would need to be checked at the border. I want to ask you genuinely now and sincerely, given that we're about 70 days out from a potential no deal that none of us want to see, are you aware of Revenue carrying out any contingency plans in relation to checks at the border in terms of customs controls? We know from the internal documents that were published last year, the 2017 report, which when they were leaked or when they were exposed by some journalists, the government told them to stop preparing. We're now 70 days out. Is there any preparedness? Are you meeting with officials? Is issue of border checks or checks along the border on the agenda? Have you had any discussions in relation to that? I understand that the committees will be having revenue officials in at this point in time, but I think we need to have an honest discussion in relation to some of this.
The first round.
So in terms of the 5 different points that Deputy Doherty has put to me, do my officials give me advice in relation to...
advice. Similar advice as what the IFAC said.
Okay, well, I thought you said advice, but I'll deal with the same advice.
Of course they give you advice.
Do they give me advice? Yes, they do. And we all worked very, very hard in the run-up to Budget 19 in the context of a lot of competing pressures that we faced to put together a budget that was the best possible budget that we were able to implement. And where I differ in the overall assessment of IFAC, and as I said, there are some specific points that I take on board, is I do believe that this is a budget by virtue of the rate of expenditure growth, by virtue of moving to a balanced position and then a surplus last year, meets key needs within our economy. But of course I am aware of the heightened level of risk that we have now. But I would make the point back to you, Deputy, that most of the engagement that you and I have had has been your view about me needing to spend more.
For sustainable resources.
And about the need to spend more. And the key proposal that you put on the table in relation to how we raise revenue to spend more was in relation to corporation tax. And you voted against all of the measures that we put in Budget Day to try and pay for the expenditure growth that has now been challenged. So I think it's just important as you're making your points. You voted against the Betty levy, you voted against VAT, and the main proposal that you put forward was in relation to raising more corporation tax.
Look at the Finance Bill, Minister.
Sorry, Deputy, please let the Minister answer.
Key facts, Deputy, and I'm happy to engage in as much debate with you on it as you want. In relation to the particular questions that you put to me on Brexit,
can you answer
have I met the Revenue Commissioner?
Chair,
we just had an exchange in which we agreed.
But you don't want to answer the question. Did any of your officials raise the same concerns as I did? You pride yourself in being answered questions.
We just had an exchange in which we agreed it's good to allow a person to finish his sentence.
But it's good to...
And that's what I'm going to continue to do, Deputy.
Obviously they did.
Sorry, Deputy Doherty, please let the Minister reply to you.
Happy to come back again, Deputy, with you on this, okay? Yeah, happy to come back.
Just answer it.
So I'll come back to your point there on the officials, but I'm going to answer your Brexit questions because you asked me some very specific and important ones there. Have I met the Revenue Commissioner on this? I met all of the commissioners of the Revenue Commissioner in relation to this growing risk in the second half of last year, where myself, the Secretary-General of the Department of Finance and some of our officials had a lengthy meeting in relation to some of the scenarios that we might have to deal with this year. So in advance of getting to this point, I had a very substantive engagement with all the key members of the Revenue Commissioner in relation to this. Have I met with the Revenue Commissioner since then? I have had at least one further meeting and discussion on the point, and my officials have had a significant amount of engagement with the Revenue Commissioner on this. And this engagement has significantly preceded where we are now. In relation to your direct question, are we making any decisions or about putting in place border checks, checks on the border? The answer to that question is no, we are not. Any preparatory work that is happening is now being done at locations that I have already identified, or the Taoiseach has, which is key ports that take in the majority of our goods. But we are not doing anything outside of that public information that I have shared. And my departments, both my departments indeed, have had a very large amount of engagement now with the Revenue Commissioner and the OPW about how we make this happen. I will say, in the event of a no-deal scenario Brexit occurring, we will be doing all we can to cope with the consequences that will flow from that, from a customs point of view. But if I go back to what I said to Deputy McGrath, there will be unknowns that will develop in the area of the movement of goods and potentially the customs consequences of that we will plan to deal with as best we can, but this is new territory that we are in. But they're the answers to your different questions. And then in relation to the advice that my officials have given me, let me go back and deal with that question directly. I can't recall what the precedent is in relation to sharing advice that I get from officials. But let me tell you that I didn't do anything on budget day that was outside of the advice that the Department of Finance gave me or the Department of Public Expenditure gave me. We faced cascading demands in the run-up to the budget. And we are aware of the challenges and vulnerabilities that we can face now. But as I said here, every time I'm in front of many different committees, I face demands to spend more. And as I said, Deputy, you voted against the tax measures that have funded the additional expenditure that IFAC are now criticising.
Thank you very much,
Chairperson, can I,
no,
just on a point of order,
no,
on a point of order, with respect, and you're always fair.
If the point of order is a point
I
of
think
order...
I think I stayed within my 5 minutes in terms of the questions.
Yeah.
There was 2 questions, and I think that the Minister should be allowed to answer it, which was in terms of the recommendations of the right report. Is all advice to the Minister written, and is it available after the 5-year period under freedom of information? I think just it's important to clarify.
I missed that question, and I will answer that. I will answer it. Is all of the advice given to me available in written format? Yes, it is. We have an ESUB process within government, and every decision that I have to make comes to me in written format. And that advice has a perspective from the department in relation to it. What I would say is that I have ample meetings on every single decision that I make. Well, no, actually, not every single decision, but I have a large amount of engagement with my officials on key decisions that we need to make. And in the context of that, I tease out lots of different options in relation to a decision. But every decision I make as Minister for Finance has to be done in written format and is done in written format. And in relation to whether is this available within a certain time period, I don't know the answer to that. If any of my colleagues do, they will tell me, and if they can't, we will come back to the committee on that.
Thank you.
I'm just going to, just from the point of view of a little bit of housekeeping and making some stuff clear. Within the 5-minute period of the first round of questions, if somebody hasn't used the 5 minutes, you have obviously, as a deputy, every right to come back in and chase down an answer you feel you haven't got. There's no attempt on my part to shut that down. If you have used your 5 minutes and the Minister is replying in the full 5 minutes, then there is a second round to come back in and to follow that. On a couple of small points of housekeeping, just for clarification purposes, Minister, you're actually, I think, due in before Finance again, not us. You mentioned that you would be back in before us, so I don't think you're in before ours. There is a break coming up at 5:15. The Minister is in the chamber at 5:15. I have 3 more deputies waiting to come in this round. If we could, it would be great to try and get that within that 5:15 period, just to allow our colleagues who have waited here since the start. So that's really where we're at the moment, except for to call the next deputy up, and the next deputy up is Deputy O'Brien.
Would you mind, just as a point of order, given that the deputy did put to me, the answer is they will be available within the 5-year period.
Sorry, Deputy O'Brien.
Thank you. Minister, I want to focus on the health budget, and you spoke briefly in relation to answering questions from other deputies, just in relation to how you're proposing to get a grip on the budget into the future. Maybe you could just recap on some of the measures that are being taken, if you could briefly recap on those.
So, just in relation to health expenditure, while acknowledging the difficulties that we had in 18, I do want to make the point that for 2017 and for 2016, we either didn't have a supplementary estimate or the supplementary estimate was significantly lower than what happened last year. In relation to what we are doing to deal with this risk, the answer to that question, Deputy, is that we are dealing with the development of that potential risk on a month-to-month basis, as opposed to doing it in a quarterly basis. And we were doing it in a way that now my department is now directly involved in a process with the HSE and with the Department of Health that takes place every month. That has not yet been triggered for the reason that we're in the second week of January, and I need a number of weeks of expenditure under my belt before we can do it.
Okay. The supplementary estimate last year was 200 million. And the supplementary estimate the year before, while it's not classed as a supplementary estimate, there was a revised secondary estimate of 500 million in 2016. So there was 500 million in 2016 and 200 last year. So for the last 2 years there was 700 million, which is, yes, you can class last year as significantly lower, but 2015 there was 500 million allocated in a revised estimate. In relation to the month-by-month monitoring that is now going to be put in place, I have some concerns in relation to that and how it's actually going to work. Minister, maybe you can talk me through it, because we already have monthly performance data which is done between the HSE and the Department of Health. And if they're not able to indicate that there is going to be a significant overrun, then what's going to be different in the monthly reporting which is now going to be set up between the HSE, the Department of Health and your own department?
So in what way, Deputy?
Okay, so the HSE publishes their performance profiles on a quarterly basis.
Yes, that's correct.
But they also do a separate monthly report as well. And the information that we were given by Mr. Colm Desmond was that under the performance accountability framework between the Department of Health and the HSE, there is actually a monthly data report which is discussed between both the HSE and the Department of Health. So,
sorry, I understand your question. Sorry, Deputy, I misunderstood you, and I don't want,
okay,
with the discretion of the chairperson, with my, I don't want the Deputy to lose any questioning because I got that wrong. So what is different in terms of how we will do it is up to that point, that has been a process that takes place between the Department of Health and the HSE, and now my own department will be involved in it.
But that would indicate that the monthly reports which were taking place between the Department of Health and the HSE were either not being passed on to your own department in relation to significant overruns on a month-by-month basis, and maybe you can clarify whether that was the case or not, Minister.
They were not being shared with us in a way that allowed us to fully understand the drivers of the issue and what needed to be done to address it. And this is why my department will be participating in it. The one additional point, though, that I would make is I have no doubt at all that if I had gone into the Dáil and I had to, in effect, reduce expenditure by €645 million in health across 2018, that would have caused a very, very significant reaction and would have had service consequences that I would have been the subject of a lot of criticism of. But what we are doing, therefore, is putting in place the process that I've just outlined to you.
Okay, would you accept, Minister, that the health budget, which was announced for last year, that the figures, and I'm quoting Mr. Michael Tutty from IFAC, he says that some 700 million does not suddenly arrive as the year goes on. there has to have been a shortfall right from the start in the figures, and we need to find a mechanism where correct or reasonable forecasts are given in the budget rather than the unrealistic ones. Would you agree with
so I accept that point, that you don't find out you have an issue in September. I accept that point. But in the summer economic statement and then in the update that I gave in September before the budget in October, I did flag that there was a health expenditure overrun. And in the summer economic statement, or whenever it was given last year, I did identify an expenditure risk. And that expenditure risk fluctuated during the year and was the subject of a lot of work, particularly across the summer, that then led to the figure that you were quizzing me on. So I did publicly call that out being a risk, both in the summer economic statement and also being in the SPU that preceded the summer economic statement, the Stability Programme update.
Okay, and just a final question on this particular area. These month-by-month reports, which are done between the Department of Health and the HSE, are now going to be shared with you on a monthly basis. What is the time lag in relation to the data? So, for instance, if we're looking at, I think the Colm Desmond said that there is a time lag in the data, so it makes it more difficult to actually estimate the overruns. Can you give us an indication? Is it 1 month? Is it 2 months? 3 months? How old is the data which is discussed every month?
It depends on whether you're talking about income or expenditure, Deputy. If it's expenditure, the time lag can be between 3 and 5 days, but normally within a week we know what has happened the previous month. If it's in relation to income, that can be considerably larger and it can be months. And in particular, that refers to the challenge of collecting income from the insurance sector.
In relation to the Rainy Day Fund, Minister, and its potential uses, I think, can we first of all clarify that the Rainy Day Fund cannot be used in relation to Brexit and to offset any impact that Brexit, a no-deal Brexit, could actually bring?
Well, as I said, at the moment, my assumptions in relation to Budget Day, the announcements I made on the budget there last October, I'm not changing them, but the first opportunity for me to give a revised update on any policy decisions will be on the SPU, in the Stability Programme update. I am still anticipating that many of the macroeconomic choices like I've made, in particular in the Rainy Day Fund, that we will be standing by those commitments. That is my view at the moment, but I am very mindful of the great risk that Brexit does pose. The way in which much of that will impact on the budget will be where we end up with the operation of automatic stabilisers and where we end up with either a balance, a surplus or a deficit. And I'll comment further on that when I get to the SPU. I should say that in the last 2 days now, I have met the Governor of the Central Bank and I have met the Chairperson of the NTMA in relation to issues and in relation to where we stand now this week in the context of Brexit.
But is it not true, Minister, that under the EU fiscal rules, the Rainy Day Fund could not be used to mitigate against Brexit?
Well, I think, as you know, within the European Commission, they have a definition of what an exceptional event is. Yes. And that definition of the exceptional event is going to require teasing out in the context of how a rainy day fund would work. But we are facing into a great unknown, which is what a disorderly Brexit could look like. As I have said to you, my view is that the plans that we have in relation to the rainy day fund will stand. In fact, I was due to take the legislation in relation to the Rainy Day Fund last night in the Dáil, and if there is a need to make any change in particular on that, I can do that in the context of either the update that I will give in April or in the context of the legislation itself.
Okay, so it's unknown at this stage whether it could be used for Brexit, but one of the things we know it could be used for is to recapitalise banks.
That is, I have no intention of using it.
But it could be used. It can be used to bail out banks.
what we now have is we have a number of funds that are available for that, such as the ESM and such as the single, well, in particular the Single Resolution Fund rather than the SRM. Why are you arguing that it could be used to bail out a bank, Deputy?
Well, I think people should know that we're putting money away which could end up being used to bail out banks. I just think that's a fair analysis.
That is not my intention, nor do I anticipate it being used for that.
But you haven't ruled it out either on the advice of your own department.
We face into so many different risks that could happen. We have no expectation or need now or into the medium term and beyond of needing to do that. And in particular, as you will be aware, we have just put in place a very extensive legal framework at home and within the European Union to avoid the taxpayer having to make capital injections, or to minimise the risk of the taxpayer having to make capital injections into banks. We've now put in place a very extensive process to look to resolve banks before there is a need for capital to be put into them.
I'm just pointing out, Minister, that it can be used to bail out banks, and we don't even know if it could be used to offset issues in relation to Brexit. I think that's an accurate statement I'm making, isn't it?
But and I think what I'm trying to be clear with you on is, if the economy takes a very, very big hit in relation to Brexit, and I've already outlined during the committee all the difficulties involved in outlining what that hit would be, I will look at all options that are available to me to help our economy respond back.
Okay.
And there are many options that will be open to me if we get to that point. But I want to reiterate, it is not my intention, or do I anticipate any need at the moment, any need in the funding will be need to use for a banking recapitalisation. In fact, across 2018, we saw the level of non-performing loans in our banks significantly improve versus where we have been, and we have seen the capital status of many of our banks quite significantly improve too.
The last 30 seconds, Minister, can I just ask you around the issue of nurses' pay? Because it is a budgetary issue, and I think as a Budgetary Oversight Committee we should be allowed. And I know that there is strike action has been notified. But how are you actually going to deal with this issue, Minister? I mean, are you willing to engage directly with the nursing unions on this issue? And how do you propose to resolve this?
So we are working on that at the moment, Deputy. The HSE and the representatives of the nurses met yesterday afternoon, and a further meeting is taking place on Friday between all of the unions involved in the management of our current wage agreement.
And are you willing to...
We are over now for this one, unless it's very quick.
Well, look, in fairness, just to develop the question that you put to me, to develop the answer to the question that you put to me, I am willing to work with the Department of Health, and I am, and the HSE to look at any issue, to look at ways in which this issue can be resolved. But what I'm not willing to do, Deputy, is put in place any measure that is going to undermine our national wage agreement. This has already happened in this Dáil. It has already happened in relation to another part of our civil and public service. When we see one part of our public service receive an increase in allowance or wages, within 24 hours there's an expectation that everybody else receives the same. And I know Deputy Boyd Barrett, I imagine, is going to say to me that's what he will want to see happen. But a challenge that I would then face is how that can be paid for. And I do not want to see that wage agreement unwrapped.
I think I have 5 seconds.
Go on, 5 seconds.
Minister, would you agree...
You're getting soft.
Would you...
This illustrates the problem with collective wage agreements. At the moment you grant 5 seconds to Deputy O'Brien, Deputy Doherty is saying, why have I been deprived?
Doing that in spite of me.
This illustrates my challenge. He's only laughing out of grace.
Would you recognise, or would you admit, or would you give any credence to the argument that pay is a factor in recruitment and retention of nurses? Outside of what may or may not happen, would you at least agree that pay is a factor in retention and recruitment?
Well, we have acknowledged that in particular some allowances were contributing to some of the challenges, but that's why I've agreed to change them.
But not pay?
No, I have said that any change in relation to pay, the demand that the nursing unions are articulating at the moment is in relation to the financial cost of that would be €300 million. And if I make any change in a pay rate, that will have to be done for everybody. We made an agreement with many different unions saying there is only a certain amount available in public pay in any given year. If the integrity of that commitment is undermined, then the need will crystallise immediately for that money to be made available to everybody. And I'll say to the Deputy that the challenges that we will have then in relation to unplanned expenditure will be immense in comparison to some of the issues that we are debating now.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a very special favour of Deputy Boyd Barrett, if he would facilitate this. Deputy Heydon has to leave.
I've been dying to get over there for this debate, so I have to leave too. I can't do that, I'm afraid. I have to get over there.
Well then,
we just try and get the two of them done before quarter past 5. I can't come back after quarter past 5.
Can we, if that is the case, if you can we try and share it so as that both of you get your questions in and some answers by your 5:15?
Right. Well, I mean, does that mean we have less time? Look, can I just get started?
Get started. Go on.
Right, Minister, I want to follow on directly from that. I was talking to the INMO and they said that basically, to cut a long story short, the Department of Expenditure and Public Reform sanitised, gutted the HSE submission to your department, which was then put together as a joint submission to the Public Pay Commission, right? Because the HSE submission to you, which isn't the submission that then went on to, that didn't go on to the Pay Commission, said actually retention was a big problem and pay was a factor in it, right? And that deeper, your department essentially gutted all that out of it because you didn't want to politically acknowledge that was a problem. You see, and this relates to the criticism about not sort of accurately estimating costs that you're going to incur, expenditure that you're going to incur, because you're not actually facing reality. And then the reality just comes back and bites you. In this case, it's going to come back and bite you in the form of a nurses' strike. Because the dogs on the street know that pay is at the base of the failure to recruit nurses. For every 4 nursing posts that are advertised, there's only 1 application. Right? We have nearly 2,000 less nurses in the public health service today than we had in 2008. Right? We're not able to recruit them. Meanwhile, we've a burgeoning of health managers. Right? So the costs come because you're actually failing to address the underlying problem. But I would like a direct answer to the question: Did DEEPR effectively gut, sanitise, or whatever the HSE submission, which acknowledged that there was a major retention problem and that retention problem related to pay?
No.
Well, why? Because I have seen a document from the INMO which shows substantial passages. I haven't got time to quote them now. Right, where the HSE acknowledged this problem, right? So I think your answer is just not accurate, and those do not appear in the joint submission that were put in to the Public Service Pay Commission.
Yeah, I stand by what I've said to you. Of course, there was engagement between my own department and the Department of Health in relation to a submission on recruitment and retention. Why did that happen? It happened because my department has overall policy responsibility for staffing, recruitment and pay for all of our public services. And as a part of the process that happened in relation to that, we had an extensive look at the data that was available in relation to recruitment and retention within our health service. You have made the point in relation to what is happening with the number of nurses within our health service. The figures that are available to me indicate that nursing numbers have increased steadily since 2013 by an average of 2.2% every year. And the view that was reached in relation to whether there is recruitment or retention difficulty in our health service it isn't one that was reached by my own department. It was reached by the Public Service Pay Commission. The Public Service Pay Commission said they do not believe there is a generalised issue with recruitment and retention within the health service, but they went on to say that they do believe that within particular sectors of our nursing profession, whether it be by profession or whether it be by geography, there are issues, and they recommended proposals for addressing that, and I accept that.
Well, I think part of the reason the Public Service Pay Commission, it would appear, didn't acknowledge there was a retention problem is because the submission from the HSE, which said there was a retention problem, didn't get to them. Key passages were essentially taken out, were gutted, and in the joint submission that came in from the employers, if you like, Deeper and the HSE, all those references to the retention problems were taken out.
But
right?
there would have been another submission that would have went in from the INMO and from all of the unions that are active within the health service, asserting otherwise to what I have done or what the submission did. The body who adjudicated over all of that was not the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, it was the Public Service Pay Commission. They're independent of me. There were things that they have recommended in that report, some of which do cause challenges. For example, they made a recommendation in relation to changing allowances. That's something that I had not done before, and I have accepted their analysis. I did not make, or my department did not make, a determination in relation to the issue. What we are basing our analysis off is an independent body that has an independent board.
Okay, well, that's not what I hear. I hear that Deeper essentially influenced the submission that came from the HSE and sanitised it, right? And I've seen evidence to show that. But anyway, I've made a point.
Did we influence it? We had an engagement with them. That happens all of the time. Because as I said, my department already has responsibility for some key areas. So yes, we did engage with them on it, as we will engage with every government department on their views on recruitment and intention. But I categorically reject, with respect to your good self, Deputy, any view that we would have gutted that.
Okay, second point on the same issue, right, is I think you're misleading the public and being frankly disingenuous when you talk about a 300 million cost to the pay demands of the nurses. First of all, you're not acknowledging that there will be significant increased tax as a result of the additional recruitment and the taxes that will be paid by those nurses. You're not acknowledging the savings that will be made in terms of the payment of to agency nurses, which are running at about €2 million a week. You're not acknowledging the fact that in order to recruit nurses overseas, we're paying foreign companies €10,000 per recruit to try and recruit people, and we're still not recruiting. We're not recruiting enough. So shouldn't you acknowledge that the price tag of 300 million is an exaggeration that you're using to deflect away from the legitimacy of the nurses' pay claim?
I don't accept that for a moment. What I have said is the pay cost of their claim is 300 million plus 115 to 120 million euro, which will be the consequence of meeting the need for increased continuous professional development hours. They're the figures I have stood by. Would that increased wage generate a higher level of tax revenue? Yes, it would. What would also happen as a result of that increased wage? Every other public servant will then come looking for the same. And you're making the charge to me that I am disingenuous. I in turn would ask you, don't you acknowledge that for any one move that is made for one part of our public service, the cost will be many, many, many multiples of that, because everybody else will then come in looking for exactly the same. that has happened before, it will happen again.
Well, in the last 10 seconds, I would just say, Minister, yes, it probably would, and I have some sympathy when you get criticised for spending too much, and then those same people demanding that you spend more, right? But you can't put that charge at us, because we did support. We did support the VAT increase. We proposed things like increased employers' PRSI. We proposed things like financial transaction tax, wealth taxes and so on, which would generate the necessary revenue. But the fact is, I think IFAC are correct, are they not, when they say you're just not acknowledging the real costs that are going to be incurred and the expenditures you will have to, and to plug the gap, you're then using unsustainable corporate tax revenues, when you should be looking at other areas of taxation, like wealth taxes, like financial transaction taxes, like closing corporate tax loopholes and so on.
And you and I have debated each of those measures before. I in turn will argue that many of the things that you are proposing there would destroy jobs and investment within our economy. And as I have said, which I will be indicating in my letter, a key issue that I think should have been considered in the debate that has ensued is that I made a decision to change a very significant tax rate to pay for much of the additional expenditure that then happens. But as you acknowledged, Deputy, you voted for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Deputy. Thank you, Minister. Deputy Martin Heydon.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for facilitating to get us in before 5:15. Minister and officials, thanks for coming in. And first of all, if we're looking at a post-budget scrutiny, I think firstly it's right that we acknowledge that for the first time in over a decade we've had our public finances are balanced in cash terms, and that we're in surplus territory now, and that is no mean achievement to you and your predecessor and Michael Noonan down through the years, and the officials that have all worked with you, that we've got the country's economy back on track to that extent, and that is absolutely crucial for all of us, and all of the different demands and the pressures that we have across society to fund. Also welcome the considerable increases in spending on our health service, housing, education, and the 25% increase through Project Ireland 2040 on capital spending in terms of our infrastructure in the country, which is absolutely crucial as well. And, you know, bearing in mind the comments that have been made about the IFAC report, that I am very mindful of the fact that the European Commission, whose job it is to formally assess our compliance with EU fiscal rules, have assessed the budget 2019 as being compliant with fiscal rules and have projected that we will achieve our medium-term objectives. And I think that has to be taken on board with any analysis of the IFAC report, which was published in around the same time. But in terms of the increased spending in certain areas, can I ask, what analysis has there been in the Department of the impact that's expected on the economy by the increase in capital spending this year? And then in terms of, well, yeah, if you want to answer that one first, and then I just have a couple of ones on corporation tax.
So the capital expenditure that we have now embarked on will have a number of second-round effects within the economy, because it will act as a further multiplier and boost within the economy as this investment increases. We would not have built those second-round impacts into our forecasts in a significant way, because they're very, very difficult to forecast. One of the increasing challenges that we are facing from an investment point of view, though, which is changing even more quickly than I anticipated, is the growing number of private sector large capital projects that we are now competing with to make happen. And even in across 2018, there has been an acceleration in terms of the number of large projects that the private sector wants to deliver. And this is certainly something that as we move through 2019, and as we become clearer on where we will stand with Brexit, will have to be a factor in capital project decisions that we make in 19 and 20. Because the growing feedback that I'm giving is that, for example, the electrical engineers that we need to be involved in our, for example, being involved in our primary care centres, being involved in our National Children's Hospital, they are the same electrical engineers that, for example, there's a growing demand for to be involved in building data centres, to be involved in building the new facilities that are happening in our country or that could happen in the future. I'm going to flag now that one issue I am going to be, that we are reflecting on at the moment, is given that development, whether we need to move the decision point for finally saying yes to projects above a certain level to later in the process. Because we are now seeing a different, more of a variance of change in relation to tender pricing and credible estimates than would have been expected. And that is happening for good reasons, but that in turn is having an impact on the public finances that I'm responsible for, and we're looking at that at the moment.
So in real terms, are you saying you're worried then about value for money for some of the larger projects, or just the actual, there's not enough skilled people to necessarily see all the projects through at the same time?
My particular concern at the moment is that we have a number of very highly skilled, complicated public projects that we need to deliver through the public service, that are public goods or public projects. And I'm seeing within the private sector a growing appetite in delivering also very intensive and very complicated projects. And what is different for us now, Deputy, is we're now not just competing for example, the engineers to do that work within the private sector in Ireland. It's also within the private sector across Europe. And very big companies who we need their skills and their people to deliver projects here are now looking at very attractive big projects happening across Europe, and also private sector projects within Ireland. And that's all going into the mix in terms of tendering decisions that they make. And that is happening very, very quickly now. And so, for example, across Europe, you're going to see big changes in how other countries respond back to the climate change agenda. That will be complicated, intensive projects. And the people who will be doing that work are also the same people that we need to deliver projects in our country. And as I said, that is a development that is happening more quickly than I thought likely across 2018.
Okay, that's probably a direct result of the last decade as well, and trying to get so much stuff.
And other European economies trying to catch up on that as well.
Okay, thanks, Minister. Can I just ask a couple of quick, brief questions then on corporation tax? In relation to corporation tax and a reliance on it, in the overall income terms, what is the proportion of corporation tax now compared to historic levels? And to what extent is the increase in corporation tax based on underlying corporate profitability as opposed to once-off factors? Would you have that on that?
Yeah. So it now stands at 19%. It used to stand at approximately 14 to 15%. In terms of the degree to which that overperformance is now driven by one-off factors, our analysis is that the majority of change that we are happening, there are two key factors behind it. The biggest one is the fact that corporate profitability has significantly increased since 2010. You know, the corporate profitability, the Deputy Boyd Barrett, if he was here, would point to as something that he is very much concerned about, something that he would view as being an example of economic inequality. That increase in corporate profitability has been taxed. And if that corporate activity refers to Ireland, we are gaining our share of tax off that. That's number one. Number two is the fact that we have made a number of different changes within our corporate tax code that, of course, are going to affect where we are from a revenue point of view. And then number three, there are a number of one-off factors that are beginning to have an effect, the most notable of which is the €700 million that we identified last year. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister. We are now effectively at we're about 13 minutes past 5. We obviously have a private session to go into, and I know we did give an undertaking to you, Minister, that we would finish at 5:15. All the deputies have had a chance, and I'd like to thank all my colleagues for facilitating. I think almost every single person spoke on the committee today. So, Minister, I would like to thank you and your officials for coming into us. We are now going to take a slight pause to go into private session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Deputies.